Hello and welcome to this week's look at the world of action and stunts on film and television. How are you? I trust you are well. We are back, a bit of a nostalgic trip this week, back to 1985, 40 years ago, for a look at James Bond. A View to a Kill came out in 1985. Can you believe it's been 40 years since Roger hung up his PPK and the Tux and said goodbye to Jimmy Bond? It's ridiculous. It gets a lot of flack, but I think it's had a bit of a resurgence of late, and it's huge fun. It's always been one of my favourites. I love it. So when I got an opportunity to speak to somebody working on the picture, it's always great. Stunt coordinator on this picture, as you know, is Martin Grace. It was due to be Paul Weston, but Martin said, no, I'll have a go if you don't mind. So he stepped in. Now, Martin stepping in means that, he can't do a great deal of the doubling for Roger. He was, of course, Roger's double for many, many years. So he chose Jason White as the stunt double for Roger Moore. He'd done a couple of pictures. In fact, he'd done Octopussy, then View to a Kill, and The Living Daylights. We touch on each of those. And it was very good to catch up and talk about what happened back in 1985 for A View to a Kill. And, we'll regroup after this. Here he comes.
Thank you for having me on your podcast.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. We're going to touch on a few bits and pieces in relation to A View to a Kill particularly. But,
Yeah,
of course, it wasn't your first Bond. You had done Octopussy before.
that's correct. That was my first, I think that was in 1983,
Right.
my first Bond playing a Russian soldier.
Were you down at the Nene Valley Railway for that section?
That's right, Peterborough, I believe it was, the
Indeed,
Inn
yeah.
Valley. Actually on the rail tracks there, where I get shot by Roger.
Right. See, everybody
Um,
wants to get shot by Roger. That was the great story that Alf Joint told me when he did Brannigan. He said everybody was queuing up just to get punched by John Wayne, and Alf sort of stood up and said, "No, no, 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 I'll do it." Pulled rank. Peter Bray went, "Oh, all right, okay," but I think everybody had a go as well. So, from the experience, how different from a performer's point of view? Let's look at the overview of Bond generally, apart from outside of action. How different is Bond to an action picture? Is it looked at in a different way? Is it approached in a different way? Does it mess about with the psyche a little bit more?
I think for me, having come from being an actor,
Hmm.
I suppose I wasn't so excited, having been in the business, a number of years before,
Yes.
and knowing its history and listened to people that had been on Bond. It didn't really faze me.
Right.
It What was nice was meeting Roger. But then again, I worked with the likes of Sean Connery on A Bridge Too Far
Hmm.
and a number of others. I hadn't met Roger during my early years, but of course it was very interesting with Roger. He had a totally different approach. Um, he was very much a joker whenever possible.
It certainly seemed that way, didn't it? It didn't matter what the situation was. He was always prepared to do something a bit lighter, either because he thought it
Absolutely.
was beneficial or beneficial for other people, maybe.
I think he brought a lot of uh, karma to a
Yes.
set,
Yeah.
so one didn't feel a great deal of tension at all. And again, John Glenn was wonderful, very, very nice man. He was very easy to work with. So in all, um, it was a great experience. And of course, this was my first experience
Mm.
on Bond.
And it's quite the contrast, really, if you compare the two, because there you are playing, a jobbing stunt performer, being
Yes.
in and around the thick of the action with everybody else, in uniform like everybody else is. You're being
Mm.
shot. You've got to do this, that. View to Kill was a very, very different animal because Martin obviously had decided he was going to be the stunt arranger on the whole picture, and
Yes.
therefore couldn't double do as much doubling as he wanted to, bearing in mind that he'd had that accident on Octopussy, so
Mm.
but had bounced back literally, I think, quite relatively quickly in
Mm.
relation to it. So wasn't able to do as much of the doubling. Why did he choose you, do you think? Or was that a phone call that you received, or a communication from him directly?
That was interesting, very interesting. Of course, I'd only worked with Martin the once on Octopussy.
Hmm.
Um, I think there was a recommendation from a stuntman called Clive Curtis,
Yep.
who I'd worked with before, and he knew that I was very much a bit of a fitness freak, and he knew what I was capable of physically.
Right.
And I think he must have had a chat with Martin and said, look, this guy can do an awful lot and help you. And consequently, it was about that recommendation, which I learned much later on. Um, yeah. So, and I think, of course, Clive he doubled on A View to a Kill. In the opening sequence, he actually doubled Grace Jones,
Well, that this is it. Absolutely, yeah. That was it's quite an interesting sequence, isn't it?
Eiffel Tower.
On the Eiffel Tower, and he
Mm,
doubles her going out onto the struts of the
that's
tower
right.
before the parachute boys take over to do
Mm,
the top part.
mm.
Um, yeah, it was so, and there's a couple of things to look at, because you would be doing the physical doubling as far as the fights were concerned. Were you doing some of the horse work as well, or was that Bruce Bowes?
Well, at the time, of course, Martin didn't know too much about me,
Right.
in as much as my expertise in other areas.
Hmm.
But I think as well, of course, that was shot pre myself coming onto the movie.
Oh, I see.
So that was already sort of arranged in France.
Okay. So it probably was not Bruce Bowes, Brian Bowes, I should say, was what I meant to say. Yes.
So in fact, they used a Frenchman who was, of course, he was nothing like Roger. He didn't have the stature of Roger,
No.
but of course they got away with it.
But
Um,
it also explains why it looks as though there's so many different doubles being used on the picture, because obviously they were filming this over there. They wanted to get that done, and then they come back to the studio to
yes,
do the interior of the San Francisco house, the fight that you're involved in with Dougie Robinson and Tim Condren.
yes, of course.
Um, it's what I found fascinating there. Um, I was we I'm in Sweden doing a film festival. We were talking. We had an editing panel, and we were
Uh,
referring to certain sequences, and how they may not have had the coverage in order to come around you to just get the back of your head and the reaction shots, because a lot of it is you're very visible
yes.
throughout a great deal of it, when you're having a fight with those. How long did that whole fight take to work out? Was it over a period of time?
Um, Period of time, I think we probably had a day to rehearse that,
Okay.
and that was with myself
Yeah.
and Martin. And what was very interesting about that sequence, he allowed me to um, do things that I felt that I could do quicker and a lot more. I had a lot more agility,
Right.
and so I could feel free. to do things that perhaps he wouldn't have done, which made the sequence.
Mm,
And I was first sort of coached by Dougie being a numerous black belt in judo.
absolutely, yeah.
So I had to do a forward roll, actually holding a shotgun
That's right. On the top of the stairs, I wanted to
on
ask
the
you about
top of
that.
the
How do
balustrade.
you manage to do that then?
Well, again, it was with Doug's help. Once he showed me, I picked that up very quickly.
Hmm.
And he then said to me, "Oh, you run down the stairs, and this happens, that happens." And I said, "Well, as soon as I roll, if I grab the top balustrade and I go over it and land on the fourth step down,"
Yes.
and he looked at me and he said, "Can you do that?" And I said, "Yes, I can do that." And he said, "Okay, show me." So I put together what he showed me, and I did it, and I landed on the fourth step and then carried on running.
Yeah,
And he said, "Oh, well, that's great because that just cuts out you going around and going down
exactly. Yeah.
merrily." So in a way, it was an advanced movement of parkour.
Yes, I suppose it would have been. Absolutely. Yeah.
And at that time, of course, parkour didn't, well, it may have existed, but it was not sort of brought to the fore in any way,
No,
shape.
exactly.
And so that was nice that I felt free as well to be able to explore other physical movements into that sequence.
Mm.
But Martin allowed me to do that. So that was great.
It's a very good sequence because it's split between the studio shot with you and the boys, and then the location shot with the American guys jumping off the top of the building and running towards the car, etc.
Yes. Yes,
Um,
of course.
and there's obviously Dougie going down the stairs. I think he went down a couple of times, if I'm not mistaken, but he went down the stairs to discover, oh, it's rock salt, and then he carries on with the fight, right?
Yes.
What am I right in saying that Tanya Roberts was in the sequence herself and doing a great deal of that physicality? Dougie t seems to remember that there was an awful lot of her actually being there and allowing Dougie to shove her out of the way and all that sort of stuff.
Yes, that's very true. What was great for me, of course, I'd worked with Tanya before. I think it may
On
well have
Sheena,
been
yes, of course.
on Sheena.
Mm,
I think it could have been at the same year, but much earlier,
yeah.
maybe late 84 into 85. So I had a really good rapport and good trust with Tanya.
Hmm.
So that was really nice.
Yeah.
Um, Tim as well. Tim was great to work with. Well, Doug and Tim, the whole team was wonderful. We had that nice rapport, a working relationship and a trust relationship. So it flowed really nicely. We had a day's rehearsal, and I think we shot it another day.
Right. And of course, the as the movie as the picture goes on, there's particularly towards the back end of Roger's tenure. There's obviously his last movie as Bond, but
Mm,
the action sequences have been thrown like the kitchen sink. We have this bit of explanation dialogue, and then here's another sequence. And of course, there's the Reme Julien and his boys doing there's the
mm,
fire truck chase with the American boys in and around San Francisco.
yes.
The burning of City Hall, which of course is Martin, a lot of the time there as well. But what about the stuff in the elevator itself? That's got to be you, presumably.
That was yes, all of that burning sequence.
Right.
I believe a lot of the exterior was Pat Banter in
Oh, I
America,
see. Right.
but then it was also intercut with close-up shots of Roger going. Remember, he was on the outside of the what do you call it? The ladder,
That's right. Yes.
wings out. So I pick up some of those shots as well in the
Oh, okay.
studio with Roger.
Right.
So this intercutting, of course, uh, John Glenn being great director editor,
Yes.
he knew exactly how he was going to put the whole thing together. But picking up the different sequences, I never came onto the movie until the jump off of the bridge in France
Right.
through onto the wedding cake.
Yes.
That was my first stunt, was
Okay.
in Pinewood to come through onto the wedding cake.
So just to splice the two bits together again, Martin jumps from the bridge onto the presumably a landing bed next to the barge. You
Yes,
then at the studio come through the roof onto the cake.
absolutely.
Okay.
That was I can remember it being my first day
It's
on
quite an
set.
interesting way to have your right. First day, you're going to land on a wedding cake this morning.
Yes. Yeah.
Congratulations. There we go. Um, it's a terrific sequence. I mean, it really does. The movie gets knocked left, right, and centre because of Roger, but I think that's really unfair because
Mm,
certainly there's another podcast called Really 007. They've been running a best fights throughout Bond series over a period of time,
mm,
and the work on this picture is always right up there in the top 10. You know, it's always at the forefront because it's good old-fashioned physical fighting.
yes.
Whereas a lot of the further down the line, that it's moving towards the martial arts side of things and the different
Yes.
types of that sort of thing.
Yes.
Um, but it's very interesting that, and then of course, again through the mine sequence. Now, the pièce de résistance of the entire thing is this remarkable airship sequence. Apart from
Mm,
the mine, we'll come to the mine in a moment, but
mhm, mhm,
the airship is a very interesting factor adding to it. You know,
mm,
um, Zorin's character, such the megalomaniac that he has his own blimp. You know, it's a very interesting thing as far as that's concerned.
mm.
But there is, of course, the moment where Bond has to physically hang on to the mooring ropes.
Yes.
Now, as we've touched on briefly in previous conversations,
Mm,
there are situations where the rope may have had an option to have like a wire in it so you could physically get a foothold and be able to hang on.
yeah.
I believe that that might not have been the case right the way throughout. Tell us the situation as far as how that came about in the first place.
Of course, that was shot at Amberley chalk pits.
Right.
They did the exterior with the actual bomb going on the trolley
Mm.
into the mine. It was all exterior, the blimp as well. And they were doing a number of passes with the blimp, and we had Elaine Ford.
Hmm.
Elaine was the stunt lady doubling for Tanya that gets picked up.
Yes.
All that, of course, you saw it come in low just for the pickup. And there was never a flight then as such, it was tethered.
Right.
But then it came to where the blimp is going away, and they were having problems to what they were going to do with picking up Bond and taking him into the air. So I was standing there and I could see it wasn't working. And Barbara was standing there also within a few yards of myself. And cheeky chappy that I was at the time, I said, well, I'm employed, but I'm not employed. And she looked at me, what do you mean? I said, well, I could run and get on the rope and, you could fly it away if you want. And she said, really? I said, yeah, 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 let me do it, let me do it. And so I did. And again, it was that thing of I trained a lot on ropes and climbing ropes. It didn't seem a problem to me to do that. So we did it. We did the shot.
That's the takeoff
That was the
with you
takeoff
jumping
onto.
onto it. Right.
Yes, yeah, we did the takeoff. Then, of
Okay.
course, they did subsequently going over towards the bridge, use a dummy.
Yeah, there is a dummy being used, but there's also, there's a shot from the cockpit, I suppose would be referred to, the cockpit
Yes,
hanging
yes.
underneath of the blimp itself, and you can see down through the glass, and it's very clearly somebody hanging on the rope. So the shot of the airship going towards, you can see the in the background, you can see the Golden Gate Bridge. That shot as they go down and somebody's hanging on the rope. That is or isn't you? No.
Well, it was cleverly intercut because I then pick up the shot as well, going towards the Golden Gate Bridge and being taken into the stanchions of the bridge, which of course
Was it Pinewood?
was at Pinewood, 60
Right.
feet in the air. The set was very high for
Hmm.
the next sequence. So it was cleverly intercut with myself on the rope, various shots.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm
Um,
not sure whether they had. Now, Martin did do a shot actually of him after the landing climbing up
yes, that's
the
true.
actual bridge.
Martin on location doubling Roger and Mike Runyard doubling Christopher Walken.
Mhm.
And I spoke to Mike not too long ago, actually. And I spoke to him regarding to it, and he says there was definitely somebody on the rope, but he couldn't, it wasn't him.
Yeah.
And there was a period of time when it might have been Martin, but he wasn't sure. So I wanted
No,
to verify that. Um, uh,
myself was
Nicholas Bennett is always referred to, but he was the airship pilot, if I'm not mistaken.
mm,
Okay, so flying now, we're at the backlot there at Pinewood now. Of course,
mm,
as you swing into it,
yes,
so it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's you and Bill Weston on the mock-up at the back, going through the fight. And again,
yes,
60 feet. It's a miniature, but it's a huge miniature. It's a big
that's
size.
right. That's right.
What was that like working back out there? Did it have its tricky moments?
It was true. I mean, the first section of it actually being taken in by a crane
Hmm.
um, and landing into all of that
Dumped. Yeah.
was a big hit. And then, of course, I had to be spun around. That was a tricky one, which we also copied that in in the set, on set, interior, green screen with Roger.
Oh, I see. Right.
So
Yes.
we picked that up. That was quite comical because Roger got on my shoulders and I went round crouching as if he was going around the stanchion. So
Right.
that was fun, tough, but
Mm.
we laughed a lot about that, me having my head between Roger's crutch.
Well, it's part of the course, isn't it, really? Uh,
Um, then, of course, the pickup was I then had to climb up the rope. But again, for me, it wasn't too difficult. So I
no, you,
climbed up the rope and then got on to and that was a tricky bit as well. But again, being very fit, it wasn't a problem.
and
Um,
how wide were the beams up there? Because obviously there's you and
the
there's
actual, the
and Bill
actual
itself. Yes.
cylindrical bridge,
Yes, exactly.
I would say it wasn't even a meter wide, barely a meter. But of course, it was rounded, so
Yes.
it was very difficult. You had to be very centered,
I
and you
mean,
had the wires.
I was going to say there
You
was
had to
there
get
was the
hold of.
wire running. Absolutely, yeah. That you've got the,
Yes,
the the cylindrical piece itself. You've got the wires running downside. Did that make for the arranging of the fight between you and Bill? You hang on here and swing that way, and did that make it a little easier because you've got some balance, some handholds?
it did. Yes, I can remember when I can't remember the character fires the gun at Bond, and
Uh,
he has to
yes,
dive down. Now that was with, of course, Tanya when she runs down, joins me,
that's right.
and that was all free. I didn't have any wires on or anything.
Mm.
Again, I did that with literally grabbing hold and disappearing under the bridge. And then we pick up that shot with Tanya in the studio where she slips, and you have a shot over my shoulder when I put my hand down and pull her up.
Right.
We did that probably a couple of meters above the ground with a crash mat for her. Um, but yeah, it was a tricky sequence for other reasons as well, because at one time um, I was working round the other side of the bridge,
Mm.
which was very steep. And I literally couldn't keep my feet, foot holds at all. Or even if I had hands, I would just, as soon as I let go, I'd slide back.
Right.
So that was a bit of a problem. But I went back to John and said, John, I can't work on this. Oh, why is that? Why is that? I said, well, it's just too steep. But what about round the other side? And he said, oh, yeah, I'll sort that out.
Okay.
And we eventually then worked on the other side of the bridge.
And how was Bill to work with up there? You'd worked together before, presumably,
Yes, an absolute gentleman.
he was always referred to as a gent by anybody who's terribly well spoken and always very gentlemanly about the whole thing. But
Absolutely. He was extremely thoughtful and caring, and he wouldn't be rushed.
no,
He was very methodical, which was great. It was fine. Um, um, a huge difference to a lot of other stunt people.
hmm
Um, he was, yeah, I can't say anything about him other than what a gentleman.
I don't think anybody's got a bad word to say about him. That was always one of the bonus points in with connection with Bill. Whenever anybody said Bill's name, they went, "Oh," and they always had a good memory in relation to that.
Mm, mm,
In the at the mine sequence, we'd have a look at that for a moment because
mm,
there's a whole bunch of bits and pieces going on. There's obviously getting out of the little office through the window down onto the sandbank there and down
yes,
there.
yes,
And apart from the all the gunfire and all everything else that's going on in there, but there's a very large water sequence, presumably with tip tanks
yes,
and things of that nature. Am I
yes.
right in saying it was you and Sadie dropping into the water? She was doubling Grace Jones, falling into the water in there, and then Roger follows her. Bond follows her in. The two of you together. Am I right in saying that?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. I, but I think myself and Elaine went out of the window
Yes, that's
in the
right.
office.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That was the beginning,
Yeah.
onto the sand and away, and then we run off. Um, and yes, going into the actual water, that was quite a sequence for a number of stunt people. It was quite dangerous.
Mm.
Um, I'd worked with tip tanks before. I knew the sound of the way they operated and the click of the release.
Right.
Knowing then you had sort of 2 seconds before that water, and a tip tank full of water weighs a few ton. So
Yeah.
when that
Absolutely.
hits you, of course, you're swept off your feet. Um, in that sequence, after that had happened, I think it was Del Baker found himself strung up in the sort of construction
Right.
of of
Just swept him away,
it swept him up in the air and took him off his feet, and he was just clinging with his feet dangling
hoping
and
for the water level to drop.
wondering what the hell had happened.
Yeah.
You know,
Looked very fast moving. There's an overhead shot looking down. The two characters are climbing away up
mm,
the side to try and get out of the hole at the very top. And Grace Jones loses her footing. Bond loses his footing. and they drop into the water. And as soon as they hit the water, they've disappeared out of shot. I mean, it's very,
Yes.
very fast moving indeed.
Yes.
Um, uh, that's not something you can presumably rehearse to a point, but
Hmm.
you wouldn't be able to rehearse with the full torrent of water over a period of time, would you? Or how
No.
was that worked?
No. No. You don't really. You just go for it. You know
Right.
that it's what it is, and you know that the shot really is over quite quickly.
Yes. Uh,
Uh, and what was great about that, once we'd finished that sequence, of course, then it's Grace herself
yes.
and myself in the water. And a lot of people have um, mixed views about Grace Jones, and I found her absolutely delightful. I never found her at all aggressive.
Right.
Very interesting. You know, she was actually quite timid.
Right.
She didn't like the cold. She didn't complain, but she was, hold my hand.
Well, John Glenn said that sequence where they're walking through the carnage of what's been left over,
That's
and
right.
he didn't tell her that there was going to be the sparks and the electrical things going off. So those reactions that she's
Yes.
giving are real.
Yes.
She is physically, shying away from this, and playing up to it, which obviously was beneficial to the character, but very clearly gives the impression that she's just a very ordinary individual.
That's right. I think at that point, actually, she may have been holding my hand,
Right.
and of course, John said, "Yes, you shouldn't be holding hands,"
Because the thing on the what I always found fascinating is that the poster or the teaser poster billing for this is Bond and Mayday back to back. Has Bond finally met his match? It's against her.
Mm,
It's not against Max Zorin, the villain of the piece. It's
that's
against
right.
her. That's the interesting thing. Pitching her almost as though she's a Jaws type character, a Richard Keel henchman
Yes.
type character. So
Yes.
very interesting in that respect.
Yes.
And then just it's remarkable that whole thing. And was that the consideration when going forward? Because obviously you also worked on Living Daylights.
Oh,
If
right.
we touch
Yes.
on that briefly, and of course, um, uh, played a role of a guy jumping up on top of the Jeep as it goes by, trying to get a car up, or Elaine, presumably, who was driving that doubling Mariam Darbo. Um, Again, a very interesting. Was that was on location in Ouazzazate, was it?
That's correct. That's correct. Yes.
Hmm.
I was playing a Russian soldier. Um, Again, that was something that sort of cropped up to be done. Um, there was, yeah, I mean, Elaine drove for rehearsals,
Hmm.
and then John Glenn said, "Oh, I need some shots of Marianne.
Oh,
Uh,
okay,
what do you think about that?" I said, "Not a problem."
stick her in.
I just talked to Marianne and said, "Look, just drive it. I won't jump on it. Just drive at 30 miles an hour, no more. Don't really look at me, just look where you're going, and I'll appear and
Right.
come on it when we do the take."
Okay.
Okay, okay. And she was fantastic. She never wavered in any way at all from exactly what we'd planned to do.
Hmm.
And she did it. They got the shots. I landed on it. And then, of course, we then were able to do the little fight sequence with the window wipers,
That's
etc.,
right. Yeah.
etc. She was fantastic, Marianne. I mean, absolutely trusted her implicitly, which was great.
Yeah, I mean, you want to be able to do that, don't you?
You have to.
If you've got yourself in a situation where the director has said, "I need the leading lady in,"
Mm,
and you go, "Yeah, cool," and you give her instructions, and she's right on the money every time, then you are home sailing, aren't you? I mean, it's
yeah,
it's very good.
absolutely. Until you're dumped off on the concrete.
Yeah, it did look like it wasn't so much. You didn't alight more so as being dumped. I mean, it was quite brutal, wasn't it? All of that.
Yes, that's right.
But all in all, an extraordinary experience. And to think that A View to a Kill is, 40 years old this year, it's
Uh,
remarkable, isn't it? To go
yes.
back and look at it again. Have you seen it over the last couple of years or so? Do you go back and look at it from time to time?
No, I daren't because my parting is so much bigger.
Yeah, the- yeah,
I mean, it was never brilliant at the time, but yeah. No, I haven't. It's not something that I yeah, I just move on, John.
yeah,
It's not something that I remember it all very, very well. I remember lots of things like having a chat with Roger's son. He was
yes,
often on set.
yeah,
He'd watch me doing whatever, and we just stand in between and have a chat. It was always a lovely set. It was very much a family affair, as Barbara would say.
yes.
You know, yeah, it was great times.
All right.
No,
Yeah, it's interesting to look now how they have so many units and so many stunt people in different
yes, of course.
locations, and evidently that was exactly the same back then, 40 years ago when they were doing A View to a Kill.
Yeah, all the different units.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
Um,
it's certainly regarded now as it did get a bit short shrift, A View to a
hmm.
Kill, but it's huge fun from start to finish. And regardless of what age Roger is, he still sells it and he still delivers it. But he does that primarily on the basis, and thanks to you and the
Thank
rest
you.
of the stunt people involved, but particularly those studio shots and the fights and all the other bits and pieces that you were having. It's an absolute thrill to speak to you, and thank you very much indeed for giving me some of your time.
My pleasure, John. Anytime.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed that. That's Jason in fine form, explaining everything about his time in the Bond family. He will be back in a later episode because we're going to be discussing SAM, which stands for Stunt Action Mannequin. Is something that he's very passionate about. He's developed over a period of time and has now been in a situation whereby, as a coordinator, is able to bring this product into film and television when the director wants something that you just can't do with a human. There are a number of things. For instance, I want you to take the stuntman's head and bash it repeatedly into this sink that's over here. If you do that, bash it repeatedly into the sink, and I need to see blood coming. No, you can't do that. You can't keep doing that over time. So they bring in dummies. They bring in lifelike looking dummies, which have been created for the purpose of this. Mannequins, stunt action mannequins. And later episode is going to look at the development over time of the dummy and how it's then been replaced further down the line. And Jason's going to help me do that. So that will be a bit later on. If you've enjoyed what you've seen today, subscribe. The button's down there or over here somewhere. I don't know. It's around somewhere. Click on that. In the links and the things down at the bottom there on the show notes is the Linktree link. Click that. That's all the social medias. And subscribe to the podcast as well while you're at it. What's the worst that could happen? So that's about the size of it for now. And until next time, it's bye for now.